Perhaps we'll start as people are coming in. In fact, it's just like a real room, isn't it? As soon as you say you start, someone else comes in the door. It's brilliant to see you all. Thank you very much for joining us for the fourth of our Oxford World's Classics Shakespeare webinars. I'm really delighted Lauren Working is here with me to talk about The Tempest this evening. So, just to remind you, we'll do our normal thing. We have an hour and a quarter scheduled for the webinar. Lauren and I will talk about the Tempest and about her introduction for about 50 minutes or so, and then we will try and draw together the Q&A that you have put in the Q&A. So the button should be at the bottom of your screen. And it's great if a question occurs to you as we're going, it'd be great if you could put them up as we go so that we can get onto those as quickly as possible. And as always, we'll try to get us as many questions as we can. Lauren, why don't you just say hello and introduce yourself? Sorry, because otherwise I'll just jabber away as aficionados of this webinar will know.
Yeah, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I am a lecturer in the English department at the University of York. I've been here since 2021. I was lucky to be in the English faculty for a couple of years before that, doing my postdoc. So it's just a real pleasure to kind of be back in conversation with you, Emma.
That's really great. I'm so pleased you're here, and I wanted Lauren to be the person to introduce The Tempest to us this evening, but also to the World's Classics edition because of this extraordinary work that I'm going to get her to talk about the impact of the New World on Jacobean culture at home. I think Lauren completely upturned an assumption that sort of it hadn't made all that much difference, apart from maybe a bit of tobacco or something. And her brilliant monograph on the New World was the reason that I thought she was definitely the person to talk to us about the play. But let's just introduce our whole project again in case you're new. So the Oxford World's Classics are built on the scholarship of the New Oxford Shakespeare, a massive editorial project directed by the general editors Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Borus, and Gabriel Egan. And for The Tempest in particular, Rory Loughnane was the scholar who worked on the text and established it and the notes. So we are really absolutely indebted to them and the larger work that they have done, which has enabled us to produce some quite sort of light on their feet and nifty, nippy little volumes, not massively overburdened with notes or with commentary, but all that scholarship is there in the New Oxford Shakespeare if you want to follow anything up. So let's start on The Tempest then. Lauren, do you want to just set the scene for us, where The Tempest is in Shakespeare's career, what kind of a play it is? Let's just start generally.
Yeah, so it's a late play for Shakespeare. Its first recorded performance is at court in 1611, and then it's performed again at court in 1613, which we might kind of get onto the context of that performance in a bit. Shakespeare dies 3 years later, so it's while he does write a few other plays, he collaborates with other playwrights on some plays before his death. The Tempest is often seen as his final of his farewell to the theater, a reflection of his own career as a playwright. There's lots of references to stagecraft, creating art in it. It ends with Prospero, who's been seen as this kind of Shakespeare avatar, kind of appealing to his audience at the end and that kind of thing. So it has a kind of special importance, I think, in that sense. It occurs to me now, it's also the first play, isn't it, in the first folio. So it's classified as a comedy. It kind of appears first in this big tome of Shakespeare's works. So in that sense, gives us a kind of real way into Shakespeare's work from the material experience of kind of opening the first folio. it's a weird play to classify, I think. It's classified as a comedy. Um, it takes place on an island that's never identified. We're not quite sure where it is. We don't know what it's called. So the romance genre kind of comes into it. It's a little bit, part love story, um, part comedy, part influenced by travel writing of the time, by classical influences. There's even a play within a play in Act Four, kind of through the court masque that's kind of staged in it. Um, so yeah, the kind of it begins with a marriage, it kind of ends with a marriage. So in that sense, it feels a bit like a comedy. But to me, it's also just a play about people under the influence, right? People under the influence of charms, of alcohol, um, people drunk with power. So it's very destabilizing. It's also just all kinds of characters being intoxicated in various ways. And lots of mentions of kind of being jostled by the senses, events going from stranger to stranger. And I think that um, that kind of weirdness of it as well is the kind of musings on enchantment that it gives us is also why the play has been interpreted in so many different ways and seems kind of full of all kinds of possibilities for staging as well.
Yeah, that's so brilliant. It's such a great thought, isn't it, that it's both it has this position at the beginning of the collected plays, and so feels a sort of gateway or a starting point, and then it's got this very heavy mythography of the farewell to the stage and all of that. But as you say, this very dreamy sort of met metaphorical or sort of symbolic kind of a feel to it. I have to confess, The Tempest was the play I did at A level. Um, and I don't know if anybody is watching this because they too have to do it at A level. Um, I was quite, I think it's a really tough play to do at A level because I think it sort of requires you to know quite a few of the other plays in a way, or it feels as if you sort of ought to know that it doesn't always exactly feel as if it stands on its quite on its own. And I've still always felt, and lots of the versions of the play seem to respond to this, that it's slightly waiting for a key to explain it somehow. It's got that the feeling that it could just open up like a box and show us uh, show us kind of what it's really about.
Yeah, and I think even Prospero at the very end when he's kind of addressing the audience in the epilogue and says, my ending is despair unless I be relieved. And that doesn't feel like it just kind of tidily fits into a comedy, the sense that
Yeah,
actually
that's
the
right.
way
Every
that we
third
see
thought
the
shall be my grave. You
yes,
think
yeah.
every third thought?
Um,
And well, yes, yeah.
and that my project fails unless you, with your own sails and kind of the wind and enthusiasm you provide kind of supports this. So yeah, I think if you're kind of studying at A level and then it's just one of the characters in the play is kind of asking you what to make of this, it can feel a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And there is a sense of there is a slight sense of tr a kind of tragedy ending for Prospero. And I suppose that's in part because we've been cued by uh, all kinds of plays with Richard Burbage in the main role, which end up with him sort of saying farewell in a more existential way.
Yeah, you have no there, it ends with them preparing to go back to Europe. But I mean, the sea is dangerous. Who knows what happens on their leg back to Europe? I mean, does Prospero get to go back to Milan? Who knows? And what
Yes.
happens when he actually gets there? He's very confident that he's restored his power, but without his magic and without his books, I mean, what is he going to do? Well, it's calling for a
Yeah,
sequel. We don't get.
that's true. I mean, it is absolutely set for a sequel, isn't it? And that Prospero's there are lots of ways this play has changed over perhaps the last 50 years. Change what we think it's about or what we think it does has changed, and partly that's the implications of the colonial project, which I want to get to. But I suppose it's also changed in whether we still believe that Prospero forgives his enemies and that's all fine at the end.
Mhm.
Whereas, I mean, we've got Antonio's complete unrepentant hostility, haven't we? I mean, there's no. I suppose you could stage it so when Prospero says, I forgive thy rankest fault, all of them, Antonio looks so very, very crestfallen that we believe it. But it's
Mhm.
certainly not scripted that he says, I accept that. So
Mhm.
you're right that Prospero seems to have given up the only power he has to get on a boat with people who hate him. And
Yes.
if the sea doesn't get them, you would think, maybe the brother will.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And Caliban, it's not entirely sure what happens to Caliban either. Does he stay on the island? Does he go with them to Europe? Um, I don't know.
Yeah. So we've got a play. Maybe we should just say this for people who aren't familiar with it or aren't right on top of it now. Takes place on this on the unnamed island, as you say. We hear that Prospero has been sort of cast up on this island with his then infant daughter, now sort of adolescent daughter, having been deposed from his dukedom by his brother. And then, as the sort of initiating incident for the play is that the brother and a group of other noblemen sort of somehow come within Prospero's power, don't they? You said it, the play begins with a wedding, and they've been to the wedding of a princess, and they are brought near enough to the island somehow for Prospero to sprinkle his fingers and sort of bring them in, and bring them in to get his revenge or to get restitution or something. And maybe we'll just introduce those two other figures. So tell us a bit about Caliban and Ariel, maybe.
Yeah, so two figures that are very ambiguous and full of possibility and hard to pin down. Ariel is an airy spirit. So this kind of other than human entity that is in service to Prospero after Prospero um, rescues him from his bondage in a tree. So he's been cast in a tree on the island by Sycorax, Caliban's mother, and Sycorax is dead already at the beginning of the play, but she's this really looming presence as well. So there's Ariel, who's kind of rescued by Prospero and then is in service to Prospero, kind of in some ways much like an indentured servant might be in England to a nobleman, and Caliban, who is continually described by the others as kind of misshapen, a bit of a strange shape. He's called a strange fish at some point. Um, and so what and who exactly he is hard to know. I mentioned his mother is Sycorax. She's an Algerian witch, as Prospero describes her. And so it does seem that Caliban's descent is part African. And that's kind of all we know about him, really.
So I suppose that does set the scene then for a play which has become uh, has spoken very resonantly in different contexts to the experience of colonial subjugation, um, and or to the experience of the New World.
Yeah.
Um, you very scrupulously said we don't know where the island is, and if the shipwreck that begins the play is somehow has come from Tunis or somewhere. It feels as if the island should be in the Mediterranean,
Yep.
but all these references, Shakespeare has clearly been listening to uh, travelers' tales in London about a shipwreck in the Bermudas, and um, yeah. But I was looking, sort of preparing for this. I was looking at Frank Commode's very influential introduction to the Arden 2 edition of the Tempest. So, a really important piece of mid sort of 1950s, 1960s Shakespeare criticism. And he says, even if the New World had not been discovered, we would have still had the Tempest.
Mhm.
That feels a very dated, it's an interestingly dated view. So what are the ways that the New World, the so-called New World, I suppose we should
Yeah.
say, impacts on this play, do you think?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, this was a huge thing for me when you asked me to write this. I was just like, okay, I think it's a play about colonialism. I also don't want to be so blinded by my work, which is all about seeing kind of the effects of English encounters with Indigenous people and English colonialism. I don't kind of want to read that onto this play and kind of feel that I'm biased and looking at through a one single filter. Um, so and also another question for me was kind of even if this play is about colonialism, can it also be anti-colonial at the same time? Is a play that's written about a bunch of Europeans landing on an uninhabited island and claiming it for themselves, can a play like that also be resistant to the colonial projects in some way? So yeah, that's something that I was really trying to unpack. I think the colonial mentality and its kind of intersections with humanist ideas about power and authority are key to the play in a lot of ways, whether or not we think that this island is kind of set in America or not. I mean, as you say, I agree with scholars who kind of say, well, this island technically is kind of off somewhere in the Mediterranean, rather than being a kind of stand-in for Bermuda or somewhere like that. But I think that what I call in my book and in my academic research, the kind of imperial mindedness of the English that's forming in the late Elizabethan period is key for kind of understanding the attitudes of the noblemen on the island, certainly, and how they view kind of nature as something that needs to be kind of controlled. The reason why the play, and so there's that element of it, which is the kind of historical element and thinking about the different influences that might have captured Shakespeare's attention and caused him to write about this. We can maybe talk about it later. I mean, there is a reference to Montaigne, the French essayist Montaigne's of cannibals in this play, for example, a direct kind of reference to a passage where Michel de Montaigne critiques European culture by comparing and contrasting them to the Tupinamba who live in Brazil and that kind of thing. So that's clearly there. There are also just phrases and this comes to the anti-colonial strand, but there are phrases in the play that have really become a kind of rallying cry against Western imperialism in the centuries after the play was written. So Caliban says, this island's mine by Sycorax, my mother. He rejects Prospero's kind of claims to the island. He looks at it through a kind of matrilineal heritage. He frequently talks about how Prospero kind of grabs the island with his magic and kind of his greed. And so a lot of post-colonial kind of Shakespeare riffs off of the Tempest in other plays, in other kinds of post-colonial literature, draw on Caliban and on Ariel as these kind of figures of Indigenous and African resistance to European colonial projects. Caliban has a freedom song that he sings at one point where he kind of imagines being a new man, of shaking off the throes of Prospero's bondage. Um, so Caliban's kind of pushback against this kind of European humanist rhetoric of ownership of the land, I think is one of the things that has really kind of made this essential to the kind of post-colonial archive of Shakespeare studies. Yeah.
Now that's really fascinating, the way this has scripted forms of resistance or writing back or writing out. And I suppose the play suggests that by making the forms of resistance so explicitly linguistic, aren't they? So Caliban says, "You gave me language, and my profit on't is I know how to curse." So there's the sense that the gift of, or the imposed, I mean, I'm just thinking that the English have not quite begun yet the large scale sort of native schools and the native
Yeah.
villages and the
So
in imposition of English. It feels
exactly,
prophetic in that way, doesn't it? Because it feels as
exactly.
if
I
it
think
anticipates. Mm,
it's 16, if the first performance is 1611, or and if it's earlier, I mean, the English don't have many claims to overseas territories west of Ireland. They've claimed Virginia for themselves in 1607, but that's the first English colony that survives beyond its first year in the
mm,
Americas. So Jamestown is a baby. And yes, there's the shipwreck off the coast of Bermuda in 1609, and the English start to colonize Bermuda. Bermuda, like the island in the Tempest, being kind of uninhabited, according to records of the time. So um, it's very early in the kind of English colonial moment. So I think the
mm,
colonialist mindset is there, and as you say, there's the Prospero's kind of paternal benevolence, I think, and the idea that language is this kind of civilizing force is kind of
mm,
very much there, without Shakespeare writing at a time when the English have a full-fledged kind of empire to speak of.
mm. Yeah, so it's ahead of its moment in some quite profound ways. That sense of Prospero as benevolent, I'm just thinking back to what you said at the beginning about the the strength of feeling that Shakespeare must be writing his own farewell to the stage. I what do you think about that? I think that's balderdash, really,
I do
which is
too.
not a word I often have
I
come
know. I
chance to
don't see it.
use, but I'm delighted to
Yeah.
feel it's very appropriate here.
Mhm.
Um, but it's been very, very pressing, hasn't it? People have wanted that. I mean, I suppose we do want a biography of Shakespeare. We want, but I wonder if that vision of Prospero as the Shakespeare saying farewell to the stage was only really tenable when we still thought Prospero was a really decent man,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that now
Do we want Shakespeare to be Prospero anymore? I
I
mean,
think probably not now. I think when Prospero was a sort of Gandalfy bearded figure or Dumbledore sort of figure, wise, perhaps a bit snappy sometimes because he has great burdens of things to think about, but effectively on the right side of history or on the right side of things. Um, maybe that Shakespeare was also a bit like that, was more acceptable, but that feels. Um, I mean, Prospero's character feels like one of the things that has changed about this play. Do you think he is? It is possible to see him as a benevolent kind of figure.
I mean, I don't really read him as I would say I don't really read him as benevolent. He does some pretty shady things. And when he's renouncing his magic at the end, he actually draws on a speech Medea's speech from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And so in that speech, he's kind of alluding to, waking the dead and things like that. So we kind of meet Prospero now towards the end of this, his time on the island, but we don't know what he's been doing the last 12 years that he's been there.
Yeah.
We don't know how he's kind of been using his magic. And so his treatment of poor Miranda as well. I mean, imagine being stuck on an island with your dad for 12 years, and that's about it, and Caliban. And her father's never really explained why they're there. He starts he starts with this very lengthy, he likes to kind of explain things to people. He starts with this very lengthy discussion or kind of speech to Miranda at the beginning, where he talks about having why they're on the island in the first place. She's never heard this
I'd
before.
never thought of that
She's
as an extended piece of mansplaining, but it's
I
very,
know it
very,
really
I think I'll
is.
be able to unthink
Yeah.
it now.
Yeah. She's got this vague memory. She's never known female company. She's gone her entire adolescence and girlhood without being around other women. And one of her earliest memories, when Prospero says, "Do you kind of remember what happened before you came to the island when you were 3 years old?" One of her earliest memories is of the kind of women who were attending her,
Yeah,
and so
yeah. I hadn't thought
it's
that before. That's
yeah,
immensely touching, actually,
I
isn't
know, I
it?
think so. Yeah. So his need to control things and kind of reveal things at certain moments and kind of treat all of life like it's his own kind of personal play, and he can play with the plot and that kind of thing is, I mean, and not something that I think we would think is necessarily a winning attribute.
No, but it's interesting to think about it as the kind of mechanics of stagecraft rather than the wise personality of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
That you can see, and as you've just explained, Prospero as a rather solipsistic uh, stage director or
Yeah,
something
he's the
who
master of the
keeps
revels.
sort of arranging characters and saying, you're going to be here now doing this, and you're going to be here, and you're going to be here. I mean, he's got a
Yeah.
little island stage, hasn't he? And he is, and that's not a very attractive um, way to think about people as chess pieces, I suppose. I mean, that we get the game of chess, don't we, at the end? But maybe a feeling that they are,
I mean, on the
yeah.
other hand, it's you think, okay, you're finally getting your enemy onto your island. Maybe this is the beginning of a horror story. And then he just kind of confuses them for what seems to be actual 3 hours, kind of almost the duration of the play itself. And then kind of everything comes together. And so he doesn't actually toy with his victims, maybe as long as we might expect either.
It's so long since I first read it back in my A-level classroom, The Seat of This Trauma, that I can't remember whether I ever thought maybe Prospero will take revenge.
Hmm.
There feels as if there's a moment in the play when Ariel is the voice of Prospero's sort of unawakened conscience, and Prospero realizes the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. Because back to my sense that this is a play, sort of adjacent, overlapping with other plays. There's a Hamlet story here, isn't there, where the brother has pushed the brother off the throne, as it were, and is what's required from that revenge or or forgiveness, and Prospero opts for a forgiveness that is ambiguous, I suppose, in its effectiveness.
Yeah.
Um,
There's very
at the end.
little about religion in the play. I mean, really until the end, and Prospero playing a bit on notions of forgiveness and indulgence and that kind of thing in the epilogue. It's another thing that makes it weirdly kind of seeming to exist in its own little vacuum. Prospero as a magician makes us think maybe of someone like Dr. Faustus, Marlowe's Faustus, from kind of 30 years before, 20 years before. But the morality around that is very open-ended.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting parallel, isn't it? We've got these powerful, bookish figures dabbling in or engaged in a magic which I suppose the Tempest works quite hard to try to reassure us that Prospero's magic is learning and scholarship rather than the kind of denigrated witchy magic, which perhaps is part of the purpose of Sycorax to cordon off those associations. But as you say, when suddenly he starts to ventriloquize Medea, that's a little bit collapsed, isn't
That
it? The sense
collapses.
that,
You're just echoing
yes.
echoing a formidable witch
Mm,
in your renunciation of magic,
mm.
which is I mean, how convincing do we think that Prospero can actually renounce his magic after practicing it for so long and being in control for so long? It's you kind of imagine he'll get back to Milan and he'll find his old books and just be at it again.
Yeah, and I suppose the Dr. Faustus parallel suggests the books are just the props for this, aren't they? They're
Yeah.
not. So when Faustus says, "I'll burn my books," and
Yeah.
obviously Prospero is echoing that when he says, "I'll drown my
Oh,
books."
my books, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, but we certainly don't believe of Faustus that he will or can, or that it would make any difference if he did, because
No,
they're simply the sort of outsourced version of what he has
it's the
internalized, and maybe the
desire for
same is.
knowledge or hubris or, the desire for control, the desire for something, that kind of fuels the the practice of magic in the first place. It's some kind
Yeah.
of dissatisfaction with the way things are without these additional without this access to the occult or to forms of knowledge that are largely deemed kind of unacceptable in society.
Mm, mm. Maybe we could stick with that idea about magic and the relationship of that to stagecraft and the mask that you mentioned. Um, it's quite a lot of the play. It rests on fairly elaborate staging tricks or moments. There's not a huge amount of plot, but there are quite a number of these quite elaborate set pieces, a banquet that disappears, or um, yeah. Um, what do you and the mask itself as an inset piece of sort of very high end entertainment? What do you think about the sort of theatricality of
Yeah,
the
I mean,
play?
I think it's another reason why directors must just have a lot of fun with this. That there's a lot of there's music, there's a lot of music in this play. Um, and yes, we do get this kind of wonderful little mini potted mask within the play as well in Act Four. So all these kind of spirits who are resembling goddesses of fertility and plenty kind of arrive to dance and present a kind of mini marriage mask to Ferdinand and Miranda. Um, and that gives that kind of sense of jauntiness and lightness, I think, that you might expect to kind of get coming out of a comedy often, which you don't necessarily get at the very end of this play. You're left maybe a little bit with that uncertainty and Prospero just wanting to talk more. He says, "Everyone come and I'll tell you more about all my years on this island." Um,
Mhm.
but before that, we get this moment of additional kind of costumes and dances that can appear in the story. Um, and the banquet is also another scene I think would be a lot of fun to stage because the stage directions basically says that the banquet vanishes, right? There's this kind of illusory banquet that's presented to um, the corrupt gentlemen, the men of sin, as Ariel kind of calls them when he's ventriloquizing Prospero. So they're presented with this glorious banquet of all kinds of foods and further kind of goods for intoxication and things. And then yeah, it is kind of taken away from them. And yeah, I don't know if you can remember any um just kind of stage, how this scene has been staged by various directors. But I think historically they've used trapdoors and things like that to kind of snatch the mask from under their feet. Recently, there's been a bit more dabbling with, virtual reality and kind of how these different illusions in the play might be projected onto the stage. So a lot of potential there, I think, for kind of bringing the kind of mechanisms of the Jacobean stage, which in its time also was full of kind of innovative technologies and kind of our own sense of what's possible in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it fits. We're thinking about this as a late play, doesn't it? Whether this is a more so one of the things broadly that happens sort of towards the end of Shakespeare's career to his acting company, the King's Men, is that they take back the lease of this indoor theatre called Blackfriars, and Blackfriars broadly is a more upmarket, smaller, more sort of boutique upmarket theatre, um, higher ticket prices, fancier people coming, and a sort of fancier spectacle, isn't it? That they've got it's indoor, so you can control the lighting effects, and various things like that. And although I don't know that we think the Tempest is only a Blackfriars play, it does seem one of the things your introduction brings out is a sort of wider world of commodification, which has one aspect which is going to the new world and bringing things or thinking about possibilities there, and has a sort of related domestic arm, which is the theatre, leisure industries, things that people want to buy, things that people want to look at. That you do a great job of sort of interconnecting those things, and that made me see that the form of the play is sort of enacts one of the things that it's about, which is consumerism, commodification in some way.
Yeah, the kind of, I think it does, I think it is possible to kind of see a global imaginary at work in the play. I mean, the way that Trinculo and Stefano, the kind of jester and clown characters in the play who kind of band with Caliban when they first behold him, they imagine selling him, for a wonder. And I think the kind of darker side of wonder, it kind of comes through in the play that we might in the Middle Ages, often ideas about wonder and amazement were about God's marvels and miracles that he put out in the world. And we get a bit more of a sense in early 17th century performance of wonder. When you see something wondrous, you want to kind of take it and sell it and capitalize on it. And the this idea that Caliban might be the ideal kind of wonder to put on display in Europe, to make money for those who kind of own his body or his person is quite harrowing, actually. But there's all kinds of mentions.
Particularly because we are there looking at it,
Yes, and
aren't we? The fairground that they imagine for
yeah.
that moment is theatre, and we are implicated in doing
Exactly.
precisely
Yeah,
that.
it's a place where, coins are being jangled and people have those travel pamphlets that they picked up, at the booksellers before they come
Yeah.
to see the play, kind of in their pockets. We get these little editions of books that you can easily just kind of slip in a pocket. And so the references to kind of silver and to displaying things, even the banquet and thinking about all the, a big part of masking culture would be that you go to the court mask, like the one that's staged in Act 4, and then you would have this you'd have your big dinner before the mask, but after the mask, you'd have your banquet of all the sweets. basically, that are shaped like ships and fantastical things. And all that sugar by this time is basically coming from Portuguese occupied Brazil. Um, so even just that kind of culture of consumption around masks and around the social lives of the elite in the play are informed by this world of commerce and global exchange. And even the beginning with the ship breaking, and I know this can happen in other theaters as well, but I think just being in somewhere like the Blackfriars and you're surrounded by wooden kind of walls yourself. And then you have this staging of a ship that's kind of fracturing and breaking and everything falling apart. I think it must have lent itself really well to that environment.
Yeah, that's so true that it's absolutely immersive then that opening scene. Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to just show I've asked everybody on these webinars to just pick a tiny bit of the play that they want to just focus us on for a minute. And we just look at that on the slide just so that we don't lose the quality and the texture of the language. And Lauren chose this song of Ariel's, which I'm just going to put up now, I hope.
Mhm.
Um, Play from start. So it's just this one. So tell us about why you wanted to highlight this bit, famous bit from Ariel, Lauren.
It was a toss-up. It was a toss-up between this one and Caliban's kind of very famous, very eloquent speech about this isle is full of noises. But I think both of them speak to the kind of musicality of the play. Um, and this one, I thought people in the audience might also maybe recognize, not necessarily from reading Shakespeare, but perhaps just because it's actually become quite ubiquitous in a lot of our literary heritage. But it's a song that Ariel sings quite early on in the play. He says, "Full fathom five, thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." Um, so quite a kind of haunting, lyrical, kind of eerie moment when the young Ferdinand is faced with the news that his father has drowned in the shipwreck. This isn't the case. Ariel is misleading him, but Ferdinand thinks that his father is dead. Um, so this really somber vision of his father kind of lying deep on the seabed. Um, but it's also a song about transformation. I mean, there's a lot of passages in Shakespeare, aren't there, Emma, where people imagine shipwrecks and just death, basically, that skulls kind of sink to the bottom of the sea and the fish kind of eat one's flesh and that's it. But rather than this image of decay or just getting eaten by sea creatures here, Alonso's bones are melding with coral. His eyes are becoming pearls. So he's not fading away or disintegrating into nothingness. He's undergoing, this evocative phrase of the sea change into something rich and strange. So it's disturbing, but it also opens up, I think, different possibilities of not of decay, but of renewal or of regeneration. Um, and this phrase about sea changes has really echoed through the centuries. I mean, this passage is on the grave of the poet Percy Shelley's in Rome. It's the title of an Alfred Hitchcock film, Rich and Strange. T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland references it multiple times. So yeah, there's something about this passage I think that has really drawn writers and artists kind of through time, and it's kind of haunting and it's sad and it's kind of hopeful at the same time.
Yeah, and I suppose it's back to a view of the play. I think, I mentioned Frank Commode and I said, he said it's not the play's not about the new world. And I think Commode says the play is about art and its transformations. And that was clearly a moment in critical history where that's what you would say. And we perhaps might not say that quite so immediately right now, but it's still there. I love those. I remember reading, I think in the critic Russ MacDonald's work on the late style of Shakespeare. I think Russ MacDonald is really great on these hyphenated words and the way they sort of yoke things together that aren't completely combined, but they're sort of juxtaposed in a way like the sort of tragicomedy or the sort of shape of the plays, which I remember being really, really affected
Mm.
by. I'm going to stop sharing that now, and I'm going to try and take us through. Got some great questions. I'm going to try and take us through some questions for the last sort of half hour or so. And there are a couple of questions. One is from Shabanka, who's asked about how the Tempest is in conversation with Pericles, Cymbeline, and Winter's Tale. And then I saw a related question, perhaps a little bit further down, from Mark about the relationship between the Tempest and other plays. He wonders about Puck. Um, maybe let's. Oh, and just, Edel just said that Jackson Pollock has a painting called Full Fathom Five.
Oh, nice. I
It's
hadn't
very
got
good.
that one. That's great.
Okay, thanks, Adele. That's great. So, maybe a little bit about the play among those late romances, or in relation to Midsummer Night's Dream. I was thinking that too, Mark, when Lauren said about this as a play of intoxication, that there seemed ways in which
And
Midsummer Night's Dream might be similar.
in the ending, if we shadows have offended, think about this, it all is mended, that we have it slumbered here while these visions do appear. I mean, this idea of, yeah, the dreams and apparitions and the kind of possibilities that come when we, in some ways, surrender to reality and kind of, and it's about boundary crossing and this kind of ties in with the question about the romances as well, that physical or kind of actual real travel is important to the stories and to the plots of the stories, but they're often kind of these catalysts for a different kind of border crossing kind of in our own minds. And into dreams and into possibilities that fictions afford. There's yeah so Miranda in some ways is a bit like Marina in Pericles, and Perdita in Winter's Tale, that these are aristocratic kind of children who undergo shipwrecks and separation from their families, and that loss of the family relationships it stands in the way of their hopes for love and companionship, at the beginning of the play at least. And then there are kind of ways in which Miranda fulfills that role of being a romantic heroine by then falling in love with Ferdinand and ending in the marriage. So there's definitely kind of parallels, I think, with other ones of Shakespeare's heroines, including others who survived shipwreck. Yeah.
Mm, great, thank you. Um, there's a couple of questions about. Owen's got an interesting question about parentage. I think this is sometimes the question we call nature or nurture. I'm going to abbreviate it just because of time. But Caliban and Miranda. Miranda grew up with no mother. Caliban with no father. Is there a link between them in how they're raised and behaved? Is it a loose connection that follows? What was so Owen's obviously picking out that parallel between them. I mean, it's a
Mhm.
parallel that Caliban misreads, doesn't he? Because he thinks we've been set up by the structure of this play to be the couple. He's sort of he's got these cues, but they turn out to be wrong ones. Yeah, when you talked about humanist education as well, I was thinking about this sort of point. But
Yeah.
yeah, what would you say to Owen's question?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think people will come at this in different ways. It's Caliban's behavior to Miranda is obviously actually quite disturbing at some points. And there's reference to him kind of wishing he had been successful and kind of assaulting her and kind of peopling the island and things like that. So in some ways, Miranda does feel very much like a pawn kind of caught between these different kind of sexual fantasies and desires. As a woman, that's kind of a very different experience to what Caliban has, even as a kind of orphan himself. Um, the loss of, I think I was quite moved by Caliban's relationship to his mother, that we know very little about who his father is. But Caliban kind of bringing up the memory of his mother at various points and kind of evoking her power and her authority and his memories of her, I think, um, are quite touching. I wrote this introduction when I was pregnant, so I was also thinking a lot about just absent mothers in the play and the psychological effects that they might have on the various characters. You don't get a sense of Miranda and Caliban ever really speaking beyond that moment, I think, right? Emma, when Miranda kind of chides Caliban for kind of speaking and for not listening. And in that moment, you get a sense that maybe she's been, conditioned by what her father has taught her to kind of think this way about Caliban. And you kind of wonder whether or not her own ideas about the world might be opened up if once she returns to Europe.
Maybe we'll stick with Caliban just for a minute. There's a couple of Caliban questions. There are a couple about Sycorax and magic and what the difference between Prospero's magic and Sycorax's magic. Brianna has asked that, and I think so too. Elizabeth Calvario, and there was one other thing about Caliban's. This is Saganique. Can Caliban's language resistance be understood as part of Enlightenment, the Hegelian master-slave dialectic? Really interesting questions. Just wondered if you, and maybe I'll just bring in Isabel as well, because Isabel quite you pick me up on a Anglocentrism, Isabel, which I absolutely take the point. Thank you, by saying it seems to me that Shakespeare does not need to wait for a fully fledged empire to have a notion of how empires emerge and grow, Spain and Portugal, etc. Montaigne, and she ends by saying Caliban turning the language to cursing is a beautiful way of turning the colonizing project on its head. Caliban understands the reality of enslavement. Yeah, so thank you for all of those questions.
And to that point, I would just quickly say I'm writing an article actually at the moment about a lexical geography of Shakespeare's Indies. So thinking about the different places, what the kind of lexicon of Shakespeare's kind of mentions of the Atlantic can tell us about his ideas about the Americas, because of this long assumption that actually he doesn't have much to do with the Americas. So to that point, I mean, a lot of Shakespeare's ideas about and metaphors and language about the Americas, he mentions potatoes at various points. He mentions the Guyana and the Indies is Central and South America. That there's maybe been a pull very consciously, in the later 20th century with new historicism and things, of kind of linking the Tempest to North America. But actually, for most of Shakespeare's life, it was very much the kind of Atlantic world of the Caribbean and Central and South America, the kind of projects of the Spanish to mine, for silver and gold in Mexico and what is now Bolivia. That's actually seems to be those reference point that Shakespeare.
Well, that's so interesting, Lauren. I really, really look forward to that article, because just as you've said that, I've realized, which I guess everybody else on the call probably had already realized, that in a way, probably later 20th, 21st century scholarship has sort of colonized the play again by keeping it in, as it were, the global north,
Mhm.
by turning it into the American play, which usually means the the USA, the North American play, a play about Virginia,
Mhm.
and that there's a second wave of sort of appropriation or even silencing of that. Yeah, that's so interesting and makes sense of Setebos and all those things which are not North American reference
Yeah,
points, are they? Oh.
exactly. Yeah, that the most kind of transgressive moment perhaps in the play is, yeah, these acknowledgements of Setebos, this kind of Patagonian deity or spirit that's mentioned in some Elizabethan translations of Magellan's voyages around South America. That this is where the Sycorax's power kind of comes from, is from this deity who seems to come to indigenous people at a moment of kind of death or border crossing. So again, this sense of the power coming from these moments of transition in some way. Yeah, so that was just an aside from that comment. So thank you, everyone. And I'm now forgetting what the questions about
There
Caliban.
was another one about sort of Sycorax and gendered magic, I suppose.
Yeah, so
How that works in the
thank
play.
you for that question because it allows me to mention something from the introduction we haven't had a chance to discuss yet. But yeah, so when I was doing some research for I'm writing a trade book at the moment about the kind of influence of the Americas on Tudor and Stuart art and aesthetics and literature through
Brilliant.
objects.
What's it going to be called? What's the
It's going to be
title?
called A Golden World. It's coming out
A
2020.
Golden World. Okay,
Yeah.
brilliant. You heard it here first. A Golden World.
Yeah. But as part of some of this research I was doing, I've came across a kind of commonplace book in the British Library. So, you know, a kind of gentleman's kind of book of adages and quotes and a kind of patchwork document of different sources that he might find interesting. And this is a kind of early example. It might be from kind of a decade or two after the Tempest was first performed, where on one page of the commonplace book, this gentleman has copied out songs from the Tempest. And on another page, a couple pages later, he has included this very saucy, very kind of icky poem called In Praise of a Black Woman, which was very popular in kind of at least by the 1630, early 1630s, which associates this kind of transgressive, sexually desirable woman with blackness and with magic and with necromancy, and also makes this kind of allusion to a, a ship kind of going into the nether regions of the world. And you can see where that metaphor is going. So I found it really interesting that a play like The Tempest was kind of being brought into conversation with these other kind of elite white masculine imaginings of women's power as being kind of dark and transgressive and kind of associated with witchcraft and that kind of thing. So I think there's, you know, it's not a coincidence that Sycorax is a woman, and that it's you know, that she's that her magic is associated with blackness and with Africa and with that kind of part of the world as well. So what I kind of also enjoyed about thinking about Sycorax and Caliban's kind of lineage is bringing in kind of Black feminist scholarship and artwork into the introduction and into this conversation. So Charmaine Lurch in 2015 had an installation called Reflections on Sycorax, I think. And Sycorax is kind of reimagined as this it's a kind of a wire sculpture of this kind of chaotic force that kind of takes up the whole space of the gallery. And so really interesting the way that women have in some ways kind of reclaimed or thought about Sycorax differently, where and bringing to mind this kind of disjuncture between how original Elizabethan audiences would have kind of thought about Black women or about transgressive ideas of magic, and how that might kind of be reimagined and giving kind of actual space for women to kind of take up more room kind of in art installations today, and the kind of connections between that and the way the play kind of allows us to do that, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm glad we got that. Kira has asked about the Hamlet storyline. Could we go into more depth, perhaps in a way that would allow someone to use it in a brief comparison to Hamlet? I think Kira's asking for a friend here. Sounds like to me like she's got an essay to do on Hamlet, or maybe on the Tempest. So brilliant. Let's just have a go at that. I'll just have a go at that, Kira. So I think what's interesting to me about this comparison is that both plays give us a brother who has dethroned his brother in order to take over the state. The difference is, of course, that Claudius has killed Hamlet, whereas Antonio has just pushed Prospero off in a boat with his books and his baby daughter. But this different sort of scenario plays out so that what Ariel tells Prospero is that he should be the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. The rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance, and he should forgive them. He should feel sorry for them, rather than, take revenge. And it's just so striking that for all the questions about revenge and should revenge be taken or not, and when in Hamlet, I don't think the play ever says maybe you should just forgive him. Forgiveness is not one of the variables in Hamlet, whereas it's become the dominant variable by the Tempest. So it is a really, really interesting comparison. There's a couple of um, uh, questions about particular lines that I thought would be useful. Kathy has asked about this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine.
Mhm.
Um, she's also brought out, I don't know if everybody can see the Q&A, but she's brought out the very particular line break. This thing of darkness,
Mhm.
this thing of darkness, line break, acknowledge mine. It's kind of interesting part of that, isn't it? Do you see this as a resumption of colonial dominant power over Caliban, or a recognition that he's corrupted Caliban or done him wrong? So that's one. And then Stephen has asked about back to the something we did touch on, every third thought shall be my grave, and asked what's the what else, what are the other two thoughts? We could have a little sweepstake on this, maybe. Miranda
Yeah,
and
I would love
books,
to.
Miranda and Milan, Ariel and Caliban, something else. But Stephen asks, I mean, really, it's a smart question we're not going to be able to answer, but the question is really, really worthwhile. Um, I wonder what the line might offer us in terms of impossibilities of closure at the end and the generic implications of this. So we've got those. Do you want to say something about either
Yeah,
of
I mean,
those
I'll say
lines?
something, but I just feel like everyone's questions are just like really great and really interesting, and kind of something we all, I think, just need to work out for ourselves as we read the play, because my opinion kind of changes about this all the time. So this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. Yeah, I think the line break is really interesting. I kind of see it as as Prospero thinking about his own capacity for brutality or for control there, that he is acknowledging within himself this desire for power that holds other people in subjection. So this thing of darkness perhaps does seem to refer to Caliban, and certainly has been seen as a statement of kind of colonial um, power over kind of quote unquote subaltern others in post-colonial thought. But I do think that there is perhaps an element there in which he is thinking about his own capacity for evil or for cruelty, and that he's forced to kind of reconcile with that.
Yeah, that uh the oh God, I'm just going to forget the title. Forbidden Planet, Forbidden Planet. That brilliant kind of crazy 50s 1950s sci-fi Tempest on a distant planet. The threat to uh the threat to the sort of astronauts or the people who've arrived there is this Caliban version of Caliban, which is called the monster of the id, I mean, it's a great moment when Hollywood has sort of got Freud in a sort of undigested way, but it really brings out, what might be implicit in that, in one version of reading that statement, this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine, that this is within, this is within me, and then, I mean, maybe Harriet's question, which we just going to go on to, is also more difficult in that regard. If somehow there's a way that Caliban is the unexpressed or repressed urges of Prospero. Harriet saying, my year eight students understandably find Caliban's attempted rape of Miranda very difficult. Do you think it's possible to use Montaigne's ideas to explain Caliban's mistaken assumption that Miranda is his in terms of a lack of nurture or cultural relativism, or can we think about it as a result of how Prospero has schooled him to believe Miranda is his? I think that's such an interesting question and contextually interesting question, Harriet. I mean, outside of that context, I think it's probably worse than you think, in that I think Caliban's idea that power over the island will be his through Miranda is really exactly the same as Prospero's sense that getting Miranda married to Ferdinand is what will secure his return to Milan. So everybody in the play believes that Miranda's sexuality and the idea of reproducing sort of dynastically or in some other way with Miranda seems to me that that's the future. And so it slightly explodes the sense of whether it's relative, whether this is the thing just about Caliban or whether it's something about the role that Miranda has in the politics of the play more generally. What would you say to
Yeah, no,
Harriet?
I agree. I mean, she refers to herself as a kind of thing, as a jewel to Ferdinand. She's her own sense of self is actually as a kind of token of exchange, that she should be kind of giving him, that her virginity is this kind of, she's been taught that this is the one thing she has of most value, and that's what she gives away when she gets married. And that kind of explains why Prospero, gives Ferdinand this whole kind of telling. So Prospero gives Caliban this whole, or Ferdinand this whole telling off, and kind of warns him, these are your nuptials, but you can't consummate this yet.
Yeah.
And so, and Ferdinand kind of says, oh, don't worry, like I won't consummate this right away, even no matter how tempted I am, or something like that. So he kind of alludes to his own kind of male desire as potentially kind of overpowering anything else. And so I think, none of the men come across particularly well in that regard in the play, beyond kind of issues of race.
Let's just see what else we have got here. Um, Tim has asked a question about the first folio. Um, do you think those compiling and financing the first folio had any vested interest in promoting ideas of colonization, and could this inform it being prominent as the first play?
I mean, you know
It's
more
really
about the
interesting, isn't
first
it?
folio. Yeah, you know more about the first folio probably than I do, Emma. I
It's
kind
a
of
really
read
interesting question, Tim. It's really
I,
interesting. I mean, there's
because
been
the
this interesting idea that the book begins with one model of sort of colonial, well, begins with the Tempest and the things we've been talking about, and ends again slightly oddly with Cymbeline, which is a kind of play about lots and lots of things, but partly about the paying of tribute by a subjected nation, Britain, to an empire, Rome. So it's a kind of about the experience of excuse me, of imperialism, kind of from the other end of the telescope, and that these two may bracket together something which is being marketed in a particular way in the early 1620s. So it's a really good question. So, it's finished me off though. Let me ask. Uh, Here's an interesting question. Is Prospero a vengeful villain consumed by the desire for retribution, or a noble hero who ultimately tempers his anger with forgiveness? I'm going to go over to you, Lauren, while I just.
Um, he's, I mean, you can read him as both, I think. This is why I think the older ideas of paternal benevolence seem to be masking actually what's potentially kind of much more um of a sinister quality in Prospero's character. But as we were saying before, it's not like he doesn't actually do anything particularly terrible in the play itself. I mean, in some ways, you could argue he lets everyone off relatively easily, considering kind of the wrong he feels they've done to him. So I think you would just have to have fun with it as a director. You could really kind of take it both ways. In some ways, I
Yeah,
have some sympathy for Prospero, but in other ways, I find him just like very pompous.
yeah.
And yeah, I don't
It's
know.
an absolutely sort of both and, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
not necessarily at the same time,
You
but
feel a
yes, I
bit of
think
sympathy for him when he's kind of he's lost his magic. His daughter, you know, his child, his only child is no longer kind of his to control, even in a model of kind of patriarchal society in some ways. He's been handed over to Ferdinand, to a, you know, to the husband. He doesn't have his daughter anymore. He doesn't have his magic. He's let Ariel go, and you kind of wonder, yeah, what he's going to do next. But you also suspect he'll find something to do to pass the time.
brilliant. There are lots of other questions, but we have covered some of that material, so I hope that you don't feel kind of frustrated by that. We're just going to do two things before we finish in the last couple of minutes. Um, I'm going to ask Lauren what she would recommend if somebody wants to take this um, any of what we've been talking about further, either watching a production or reading something, and then we'll talk about. We have mentioned a little bit of Prospero's relationship with Ariel NJR, who's just come in at the very last minute, but perhaps not enough. Thanks for the question. So, Lauren, what would you recommend to anybody who wants to go further with this?
Yes. Well, yeah, first of all, echoing Emma, thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions. I'm just kind of looking through them now, and you're inviting all kinds of different thoughts and interpretations of the text, which is brilliant. And I'm sorry I can't kind of address all of them. But so I mean, there's a book from I think about 2006 called The Tempest and Its Travels. I think if you're kind of interested in the context of voyaging drama and kind of these global trajectories of travel in the Jacobean period and beyond. That's kind of a fun anthology to look through. A recent reflection on the Tempest that I have found really fascinating is the Mohegan playwright Madeline Sayet, who wrote a piece called Where We Belong for the Globe that was performed at the Globe a couple years ago, and provides a kind of indigenous response and reflection to Caliban and to Ariel and the Tempest. And I think it's a really interesting way into thinking about how the issues of colonialism and colonial resistance kind of come in from an indigenous context. Um, yeah, I mean, I was lucky to see a theatrical production of The Tempest with Ralph Fiennes as Prospero, which definitely I think makes you slightly more sympathetic to him. I don't know if that's available to see online at all, but I think it was from around 2016 at the Royal Court in Newcastle.
Brilliant. I think I might add to that um, the version. I think the film version of The Tempest that I like the best is probably Derek Jarman's, which is a very odd but
If, yeah.
enjoyable and has keep some of the weirdness that I think the play also has.
Yeah, you want the
So
nymphs and harpies to get their due,
yeah,
and I think Harp gives that to you. Yeah.
absolutely, and a lovely camp lot of sort of Jean-Paul Gaultier kind of sailors, which is always fun. We've got a couple of open questions. Claire has asked about Montaigne and the Tempest. There's a recent Edinburgh University Press called Shakespeare, Edinburgh University Press book called Shakespeare and Montaigne, edited by lots of people, including Lars Engel, I think, which is great and exhaustive. And there's a lovely New York Review of Books edition of Shakespeare's Montaigne, which I think might have an introduction by Greenblatt. Um, and Sarah Bakewell's book on Montaigne is very lovely about whether when I play with my cat, she is playing, she thinks she's playing with me. Um, Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. For the start of May, we have the merriment that is Titus Andronicus with Harry McCarthy. If you're based in the UK, you might want to make a Titus month of May. The play is just about to open at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford, but do read along with us for next time if you have the opportunity. And thanks so much to Lauren Working and to all of you for being here this evening. Thanks.
Yes, thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.